doctrine that Catherine was going to become part of the royal family. So the king then got his younger son, Henry, engaged to Catherine. There was a problem with this marriage. Henry was only 10 and Catherine was 26. Nevertheless, they became engaged. When Henry got old, Henry VII got old, Henry VIII, they got old enough, he was forced into a marriage with Catherine of Aragon, even though she was much, much older. Well, to do this, I mean, it was illegal for a person to marry their brother's wife, but Henry VII had gotten what's called an indulgency from the Pope. And the sale of indulgencies, by the way, is one of the things that led to the Protestant Reformation. But Henry VII got an indulgency from the Pope, and the Pope said it was okay. So the marriage was made legal. And Henry VIII, then, the son of Henry VII, we grew up. When Henry VII died, Henry VIII became king, and Catherine became the queen. Well, you can pretty well guess. I mean, when I was a young man, and this is still going on, a lot of women who are 30 will sometimes marry a teenager. And a lot of times women in their 40s will marry men in their 20s. This was a big issue, I mean, 6 or 8 years ago. There's a big problem with that, folk. If you're a man, your wife is going to start looking old to you before you're 30 years old. This happened, of course, to King Henry VIII. His wife became an old woman before her time. I mean, about before her time, but she started, and then he set his eyes on one of her ladies in waiting. Now, he had a daughter named Mary by Catherine, but then he wrote a letter to the Pope saying, "The Pope, I really feel like I'm living in sin with Catherine. Can you grant me a divorce from Catherine? Because after all, Catherine was once my brother's wife, and the church has always forbade a man from marrying his brother's wife, so Your Holiness, can you grant me a divorce?" Now, under normal circumstances, the Pope might have granted a divorce. By the way, it's a different Pope than the Pope that had given him permission to marry in the first place. Popes usually only lasted about 5 years because they were usually very old men when they got to be Pope. And they didn't last long. And that still is a lot of the time the case. But anyway, the Pope normally might have granted, except for one thing. Catherine of Aragon was really closely related to Charles V, like his sister or something like that. And the Pope wrote a letter back, "Sorry, I cannot grant you the divorce." The answer was no. Henry VIII was very upset, so Henry VIII went to the Archbishop of Canterbury and said, "I want you to help me break away from the Pope and the Catholic Church, and we're going to found our own church." The Archbishop of Canterbury is really happy to do that, so they founded a new church called the Church of England, which we know of today as the Episcopal Church. Well, okay, make a long story short, Henry VIII got his divorce. He went on to have a few children, one named Elizabeth, who became Elizabeth I, and a son named Edward. But anyway, to make a long story short, England went back and forth for time between Protestantism and Catholicism, with some kings becoming Protestant, some Catholic. But there was a group among them who said that, no, wait, the Episcopal Church, the Church of England, did not go far enough. We want to go farther. These people were called the Separatists. Well, actually, they're called the Puritans. The Separatists were even more extreme. The Puritans said, we want to purify the Church of England of all these Catholic practices that we don't agree with. We want to become more like John Calvin. We want to become more like Martin Luther. We want to become more like Zwingli. Or they wanted to copy some of the more radical Protestant movements. So they wanted to break away. They were the Puritans. But a group of Puritans wanted to go even farther. They were called the Separatists. They said, we can't reform the Church of England. We want to separate. Well, some Separatists moved into Holland, where they had religious freedom, because the Separatists were persecuted by both Catholic and Protestant. The Separatists moved into Holland, but they didn't like Holland. The Separatists insisted on wearing dark-colored clothes. The Dutch people wore bright clothes. The Dutch people believed in going to going to theaters and putting on puppet shows. The Separatists said this was worldly. Then the English children started playing with the Dutch children. They started picking up the Dutch language, and they were forgetting English. Then eventually the parents could not understand them. And the parents said, we can't live like this. So they got there, let's go to Virginia. So they set sail on a ship called the Mayflower. They went on the Mayflower, and they went from, set sail for Virginia. But on the way, they had some people among them who were not separatists. And the separatists feared that because they were in the minority, they'd be persecuted. So they signed an agreement called the Mayflower Compact, which said we will recognize everyone, every Christian, regardless of whether you're Catholic, Protestant. The Mayflower Compact did not include non-Christians, but it did include all Christian groups. It said we're going to respect all Christian groups. And they landed, except for one thing, they were blown off course. They intended to go for Virginia, but they actually in some way had the good fortune of being blown off course. They landed up in near today, Boston, Massachusetts.
That's way off course.
Plymouth. They were way off course. You know what I mean? Hey, keep in mind, just a little bit off course at the beginning of your, and you get more and more off course as you go. So it wasn't like they got blown off course when they got in. They were started to be blown off course on their way in. Things were rough, but when they got to Massachusetts, they found there were hardly any Indians, owing to the fact that some disease had wiped out almost all the Indians. We know not what, but it might have been brought in by fishermen, but some disease had wiped out almost all the Indians. But there were 2 Indians who spoke English. These Indians had been captured by a slave ship and eventually released back to their home territory. Once home, they found that all their relatives had died. But they made their way into the Puritan camp one day, and they taught the Puritans, the separatists, or the Pilgrims are called now. They taught how to farm. All right. They thrived pretty well, and they did pretty well, but they were a strange group of people. In 1620, another group of Puritans moved in and started a Puritan colony separate from the other. Now, one reason why the separatists did as well as they did was they got into a climate where there were no mosquitoes. The climate was more like the English climate they'd come from. And even though they did die of diseases at first, the Indians helped them. But now the Puritans, when they came in 1620, they ignored the Plymouth colony that had been started. The Puritans came in 1632. They ignored the colony that had been started in 1620. They came 12 years later. But they set up their own colony. It was going to be a city on a hill. Their colony was purely socialist. They cleared a bunch of land. And the governor said to the people, now all of you are going to farm this plot of land. And come fall, they had a starving time. Basically, they set up a communistic system. The next year, the governor said to each family, you take this plot, and you take this plot, and you take this plot, and everybody farmed their own land. And they had a harvest, a feasting time. The governor said he knew that women, who he would not even ask to work, would volunteer and get up and get out to work because they were working for themselves. And then when it was over with, they had a big harvest and said, of course, some family had more than others, but he said the families that had more than needed willingly gave to the families that had less. And they had a big festival, and this festival we today celebrate as Thanksgiving. Eventually, the colony of the Plymouth colony and the Puritan colony merged together. But the Puritan colony was founded on really strict religious principles, and this is where we get to Roger Williams. Roger Williams objected to a few things that he saw. Number one, he objected to the way the Indians were being mistreated. He said the Indians are being cheated. He also objected to forced conversions into the church. He said church membership should be voluntary. Folk, I mean, with our 21st century mind, we pretty well have to take Roger Williams' side. But if you had lived at the time, you might not have. To make a long story short, Roger Williams was banished from the colony. Roger Williams then moved south and founded the colony of Rhode Island, which is today the smallest state in the Union, but it was just located just south. But he founded the colony of Rhode Island. Then, during the colony of Rhode Island, he said that anybody was free to join the church or not to. You did not have to join the church in order to hold office. Now, this business of joining a church to hold office, folk, as recently as 20 or 30 years ago, I mean, officially, There's no constitution in any state that requires an office holder to be a member of a church. But most voters would only vote for church members. Now today, that's not as true. More and more, we're getting one man who's an out-and-out atheist has become elected, and more than one now. But that could not have happened 20 or 30 years ago. But again, it was by choice of the electorate, though for many years, every politician was a church member. Now, one notable exception, Abraham Lincoln did not join any church, but Lincoln was elected under different circumstances. Well, I'll tell you what it was. One of the things, Abraham Lincoln was not a Mason. And that got him thousands upon thousands of votes, because there was a strong, we're talking about an anti-Mason sentiment. And Abe Lincoln was not one. But he had to surround himself with men who were.